Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. I spotted the job listing 2 weeks ago. Wanted night guard at Henry's Market. 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift. $21 per hour. The whole thing struck me as odd right away. What kind of grocery store needed a security guard overnight, especially when it wasn't even open? What crime that rampant in such a quiet town? Still, I was desperate for work. After a quick phone interview with someone named Clive, I found myself pulling into the parking lot for my first shift 2 days later. As I approached the store, it all began to make a strange kind of sense. The grocery store sat on the edge of a dilapidated strip mall, flanked by vacant shops with massive for rent signs hanging in dusty windows. Flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows on cracked pavement, and the faint hum of buzzing fluorescent lights broke the silence. I parked near the entrance and climbed out. Just as I started toward the building, a woman appeared, hurrying away from the store. "You must be Aaron," she said, slightly out of breath. "The new night guard." "That's me," I replied. "Clive left instructions for you on the conveyor belt at Register 1. She nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact, then slipped past me toward the only other car in the lot. "Thanks," I called after her. "What's your name?" She didn't answer. Before I could say another word, she dove into her car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the lot, leaving me alone in the unsettling stillness. So much for making new friends. Turning back to the store, I noticed the lot was now eerily empty, the nearest streetlight flickering in an almost deliberate rhythm. A cold wind swept by, carrying an old paper bag across the asphalt. "Well, here goes nothing," I muttered, and walked up to the sliding glass doors. They squeaked as they parted, welcoming me into the unnervingly pristine interior. Contrary to the exterior, the store was clean and brightly lit. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while smooth jazz drifted from hidden speakers. I made my way to Register 1, where a folded piece of paper lay waiting. I picked it up and began to read. "Dear Aaron, welcome to the Henry family. We're thrilled to have you on board. To ensure your success, we've prepared a few simple rules to help you through your shift. Patrol the store every 30 minutes to ensure everything is in order. Between patrols, you may monitor the security cameras in the break room. Avoid aisle 7. Do not look down aisle 7 under any circumstances. If you hear knocking from the frozen food aisle, ignore it. Return any shopping cart found out of place to the designated area at the front of the store. If you find a pool of blood in the meat section, clean it promptly without touching it directly or stepping in it. Should you encounter a woman in the store, go to the break room immediately and stay there until she leaves. Do not engage, and do not call the authorities. If the music stops playing, retreat to the break room until it resumes. Under no circumstances may you end your shift early. Thank you, and good luck. Clive. I stared at the list, trying to make sense of it. My hands gripped the paper tightly as a chill ran down my spine. The rules weren't just strange, they were unnerving. What did Clive mean by ignore knocking? And why was I supposed to avoid aisle 7? A voice in the back of my head screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive home, but the $21 an hour, and my overdue rent, kept me planted in place. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. "Rules are rules," I muttered. The store's silence stretched on, punctuated only by the hum of the overhead lights and the faint drone of smooth jazz. A quick glance at my phone told me it was 12:10 a.m. Time to start my first patrol. The store felt unnaturally still as I walked the aisles. Shelves lined with canned goods, boxed cereals, and bottled drinks stared back at me under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Aisle 3, pasta and sauces. Aisle 4, snacks and chips. I counted the aisles as I passed them, my shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. When I approached aisle 7, I kept my eyes trained on the floor. The rule was simple: don't look. But as I walked past, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my steps quickened involuntarily. By the time I rounded the corner into the meat section, my pulse was racing. I half expected to find a bloody mess waiting for me, but the area was clean. The sealed cases displayed cuts of beef and chicken behind thick plastic sheets, eerily perfect and untouched. The rest of the store was uneventful, and I returned to the break room to review the camera feeds. The black and white monitors showed the aisles in grainy clarity. Everything looked normal, though I noticed one thing that set me on edge. The cameras for aisle 7 were offline. Static filled the screen where aisle 7's feed should have been. I stared at it for a moment before glancing at the time. 12:40, time for another patrol. This time the silence seemed louder. As I walked, I felt the weight of the empty aisles pressing in on me. I kept my head down as I passed aisle 7, but I couldn't stop my peripheral vision from catching something. Movement. A shadow darted at the edge of the aisle, too fast and too fleeting to fully register. My breath hitched, and I froze mid-step. Ignore it, I reminded myself. Follow the rules. Forcing myself to move forward, I completed the patrol and returned to the break room. My hands shook as I reached for the coffee machine in the corner. The next 2 hours passed slowly. I followed the rules, kept my patrols regular, and did my best to ignore the occasional sounds, faint knocks from the freezer doors and distant whispers that didn't seem to have a source. At 3 a.m., everything changed. I was halfway through a patrol when I saw it, a shopping cart, parked in the middle of the frozen food aisle. I stopped, staring at it. My reflection warped in its shiny metal surface, and the squeaky wheel pointed at an odd angle. I hadn't noticed the cart on my previous patrols. My stomach twisted, but the rules were clear. Return any misplaced carts to the front of the store. Swallowing my unease, I grabbed the cart's handle and began pushing it toward the entrance. The cart resisted as if the wheels had locked in place, dragging loudly against the floor. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I struggled to move it, its weight inexplicably heavy. Halfway there, a loud bang shattered the silence. It came from behind me, deep within the frozen food aisle. I froze. Another bang, louder this time, echoed down the aisle. The cart's handle felt like ice in my hands, and my feet refused to move. Slowly, I turned my head. The freezer doors shook violently, as if something inside was slamming against them, trying to escape. Ignore it. The rule screamed in my mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, abandoning the cart as I bolted toward the front of the store. When I reached the break room, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. The freezer's banging continued, growing softer and softer until it faded into nothingness. I glanced at the monitors. Most of the feeds showed empty aisles, but my heart stopped when I noticed the feed for aisle 7. The static was gone. In its place, the camera displayed a dimly lit aisle filled with shadowy figures. They stood motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Before I could process what I was seeing, the monitor went black. I stared at the blank monitor, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The shadowy figures in aisle 7 were burned into my mind. My rational side fought to explain what I'd seen, an equipment malfunction, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. For a moment, I considered quitting on the spot, abandoning the job and driving far away. But then I remembered the last rule. Under no circumstances may you end your shift early. I didn't know what would happen if I broke that rule, but something told me I didn't want to find out. I checked the time, 3:15 a.m. Another patrol was due in 15 minutes. I rubbed my temples, trying to calm the pounding in my head. Just follow the rules, I thought. You'll be fine. The silence outside the break room felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I took a shaky breath and stepped out. The air seemed colder, and the smooth jazz playing over the speakers had taken on a dissonant, warped quality. The aisles were just as I had left them, but the oppressive atmosphere made me feel like I was trespassing. As I approached aisle 7, I kept my eyes firmly on the floor. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I passed it, I heard it, a faint, breathy whisper. "Look at me." I froze. The whisper was soft but clear, as if someone had spoken directly into my ear. My entire body tensed. "Look at me," it repeated, louder this time, the voice cracking unnaturally at the edges. I clamped my hands over my ears and hurried forward, refusing to look. My vision blurred as panic set in, but I didn't stop until I was halfway down the next aisle. I turned a corner, my legs trembling, and found myself in the meat section. That's when I saw it. A dark, spreading pool of blood. It seeped out from beneath one of the plastic covers, forming a viscous puddle on the floor. The smell hit me first, coppery and sharp, tinged with rot. The rules echoed in my mind. Clean it promptly without touching it directly or stepping in it. I grabbed a mop and bucket from a nearby closet and approached the mess, my nose wrinkling at the stench. Kneeling as far from the puddle as I could, I soaked the mop in the blood and wrung it out into the bucket. The blood seemed endless, pooling faster than I could clean it. My hands ached from wringing the mop, and I had to fight the urge to gag as I worked. After what felt like an eternity, the puddle began to shrink. Just as I thought I was making progress, a low, guttural sound rumbled from behind me. I froze, gripping the mop like a weapon. Slowly, I turned my head. A pair of glowing red eyes stared at me from the other side of the meat counter. The creature's outline was shadowy and indistinct, but its presence radiated malice. It leaned closer, its form pressing against the plastic sheet that separated us. The sound it made was inhuman, like a growl mixed with wet, raspy breathing. I dropped the mop and bolted. My footsteps echoed through the store as I ran for the break room. Behind me, I heard the sound of plastic ripping, followed by the scrape of claws on tile. I barely made it inside before slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of the creature. Silence. I backed away, my hands trembling. When I glanced at the monitors, I saw nothing unusual, just empty aisles and static where aisle 7's feed should have been. The blood, the eyes, the whispers. It was all too much. I checked my phone. 4:30 a.m. Just an hour and a half left. I sank into the chair, trying to calm myself. My mind raced with questions. What the hell was this place? Why did Clive hire me? And who, or what, was the woman mentioned in the rules? As if on cue, I heard it. Soft footsteps outside the break room. They were deliberate and slow, coming closer with each passing second. My stomach churned as I remembered Rule 6. Should you encounter a woman in the store, go to the break room immediately and stay there until she leaves. Do not engage, and do not call the authorities. She was here. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Click. The doorknob turned. I leapt to my feet, heart pounding, and pressed my back against the far wall. The door rattled slightly as if someone was testing the lock. "Aaron!" a soft, feminine voice called. It was almost sing-song, but there was something off about it. Something hollow. "Aaron, let me in." I bit down on my hand to stifle a scream. The door rattled harder now, the doorknob twisting back and forth. "Please, Aaron, I just want to talk." I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed myself further against the wall. "Don't engage. Don't engage." The rattling stopped, replaced by silence. I opened my eyes, my heart still racing. Then the lights in the break room flickered. The monitors went black one by one, their soft hum disappearing. The woman's voice returned, now a guttural whisper that echoed in my skull. "You can't hide forever." The lights flickered again and then steadied. When I glanced at the monitors, aisle 7's feed had returned. The shadowy figures were back, but this time, they were moving, turning slowly, their eyeless faces fixed toward the camera. I couldn't tear my eyes from the monitor. The shadowy figures in aisle 7 moved with an eerie, disjointed rhythm, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. Their heads tilted at impossible angles, and their limbs jerked unnaturally. The longer I stared, the more I felt them staring back, their blank faces locked onto the camera lens, as if they knew I was watching. Suddenly, the feed flickered. When it came back, the figures were gone. The aisle was empty again, bathed in dim fluorescent light. My stomach churned. I pushed away from the desk, needing distance from the monitors, but the oppressive silence in the break room offered little comfort. The clock read 4:45 a.m., only an hour and 15 minutes left, but it felt like an eternity. I had to keep moving. Sitting still wasn't an option. The store's rules demanded it. If I broke the pattern now, who knew what might happen? Reluctantly, I unlocked the door and stepped out. The store greeted me with the same cold, artificial light, but something about the air felt heavier, thicker. The smooth jazz, which had warped and slowed earlier, now sounded distorted, as if the speakers were underwater. I began my patrol, each step feeling more labored than the last. The aisles were quiet, but the faint sense of being watched followed me everywhere. I avoided aisle 7 entirely, giving it a wide berth as I passed. Even so, the sensation of eyes boring into the back of my head made my skin crawl. In the frozen food aisle, I paused. The freezer doors stood perfectly still, and the air was unnervingly cold. I almost convinced myself the earlier banging had been my imagination, until I saw the frost. On the glass of one of the freezer doors, a series of handprints had appeared, etched into the frost from the inside. They were small, like a child's, and perfectly formed. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Ignore it. I clutched the mop handle tighter and forced myself to move on. When I reached the meat section, I froze. The pool of blood was back. It was larger this time, spreading out from the same cooler I'd cleaned earlier. The coppery stench was overwhelming, and the sticky, dark liquid seemed to pulse, as though alive. I wanted to turn around, to run back to the break room and barricade myself inside, but the rules left no room for debate. Grabbing the mop, I approached the puddle. My hands trembled as I wrung the mop out over the bucket, the blood dripping in thick, viscous strands. As I cleaned, the air around me grew colder. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound began to echo through the section, like fingernails drumming against metal. I didn't look up. I couldn't. The tapping grew louder, coming from the cooler directly in front of me. My reflection wavered in the blood-smeared plastic, distorted by the red haze. Then, without warning, the cooler door creaked open. I fell back, the mop clattering to the floor. Inside, the cooler was dark, its shelves empty except for a single slab of raw meat sitting on the middle rack. It looked wrong, grayish, with veins of black running through it. And then it moved. The slab twitched, jerking like a fish out of water. Slowly, it began to slide toward the edge of the shelf. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as the meat fell to the floor with a sickening splat. It lay there, quivering, before a long, thin appendage emerged from one side. A clawed hand. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Grabbing the mop bucket, I ran, the squeaking wheels echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in the break room, the door locked securely. The monitors flickered as I sank into the chair, my chest heaving. The feed for aisle 7 was still online, but now the camera displayed something new. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle. It wasn't shadowy like the ones I'd seen before. This one was clearer, more defined. It was the woman. She wore the same blue dress as before, and her long black hair hung over her face. Her hands dangled limply at her sides, but there was something wrong with them. Her fingers were too long, the joints bending backward unnaturally. She stood motionless, staring at the camera. As I watched, she began to move, her head jerking in short, sharp motions. Her arms swung like pendulums as she walked down the aisle, coming closer to the camera with every step. My breath caught in my throat. When she reached the camera, she stopped and tilted her head, her face still obscured by her hair. And then she looked up. Her eyes were black voids, endless and consuming. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She pressed a single finger to her lips. The feed went dark. I scrambled away from the monitors, my back hitting the wall. My body shook violently as the lights in the break room flickered. A soft knock came at the door. Knock, knock, knock. "Aaron!" her voice called, sing-song and melodic. "Let me in." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. "You can't ignore me forever," she hissed, her voice distorted and crackling like static. The lights above me buzzed and dimmed, casting the room into shadow. I stared at the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then it stopped. Silence. The lights flickered back on, and the monitors resumed their static hum. I glanced at the clock. 5:30 a.m. 30 more minutes. The silence in the break room was suffocating. My ears still rang from the relentless knocking, and my body was trembling uncontrollably. I checked the clock again. 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes left. I tried to steady my breathing, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. The woman, the creatures, the rules. They all swirled together in my mind, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Just get through it. Follow the rules. Get through the shift. But the calm was fleeting. A sudden thump from the back of the store broke the silence, followed by a series of scraping sounds. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise was coming from the direction of the meat section. The scraping grew louder, then more frantic, like something dragging itself across the floor. My stomach churned. The last time I'd been in that section, the blood had reappeared, and I had seen that creature, its claws, its twisted movements. The scraping sound continued, echoing through the store. It was closer now, coming down the aisle, and it sounded heavier. I had to investigate. If I didn't, I might be fired for not fulfilling my duties. But the thought of facing whatever was lurking in that aisle made my legs go weak. A sudden, sharp crack sounded from behind me. I spun around. The door to the break room was slowly opening. I couldn't see anyone, just the dark outline of the door creeping open inch by inch, as if something on the other side was pushing it open. I slammed the door shut, locking it. Don't engage, don't engage. But the knocking resumed, louder now, as if something was trying to get in. "Aaron, I know you're in there," the woman's voice purred, its tone shifting into something deeper, more guttural. "Come out, Aaron, I want to talk." I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes, counting the seconds, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. "Just stay in the break room. Don't leave. Don't break the rules." The knocking stopped. I thought for a fleeting moment that maybe the worst was over. Then the lights flickered again. The security monitors buzzed and turned black one by one. I rushed over to check, panic rising in my chest. The feed for aisle 7 had returned. But the view was different this time. The aisle was completely dark, pitch black, not a single light in sight. And yet, there was movement. I could make out the faintest outline of something standing in the dark. A figure, hunched low, barely visible. It was the woman again. She stood at the far end of the aisle, her back bent at an unnatural angle. Her hands were pressed against the shelves as if she were feeling her way in the dark. Click, click. Her feet shuffled across the floor, each step slow and deliberate, until she moved closer to the camera. Her hair hung in front of her face like a dark curtain. I saw her then, in full. Her skin was pale, unnaturally so, almost translucent, and her arms were long and skeletal. Her fingers twitched unnervingly as if they were reaching for something just out of reach. And then, without warning, she looked up. Her eyes were gone, just empty sockets where they should have been. A thick, black tar-like substance leaked from them, dripping down her face like tears. Her grin stretched even wider, splitting her face unnaturally. Her mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, the edges of which were covered in black sludge. Knock, knock, knock. The door rattled again. I couldn't move. The sight of the woman on the monitor, her face twisted into something I couldn't comprehend, paralyzed me. The knocking continued. "Open the door, Aaron. It's time." I could hear her voice clearly now, no longer muffled by the door. It sounded wrong, too close, too real. The scratching, dragging sound from the meat section resumed, growing louder with each passing second. It was relentless, coming closer to the break room. I turned to look at the door again. It was slowly opening once more, and through the small gap, I saw a shadow on the other side. Something large, something moving. My breath caught in my throat. It was too much. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay in this store any longer. But the rules. I could already hear the whisper of Clive's voice in my head. Under no circumstances may you end your shift early. I checked my phone again. 5:50 a.m. 10 minutes. 10 more minutes, and I could leave. But the door to the break room was fully open now. The figure on the other side was no longer just a shadow. It was a man. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, his face pale and gaunt, just like the woman's. I backed away into the corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stepped inside. "Aaron," he said, his voice low and rasping, like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "You can't leave. Not yet." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed, jerking away. But when I looked around, no one was there. The room was empty. Aisle 7 was empty. The woman was gone. The lights flickered once more and dimmed, casting the break room into an eerie half-light. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. A shape moving across the floor. I turned sharply, and there she was, standing in the doorway of the break room, smiling. The door to the break room stood wide open now, and there she was, her grotesque smile stretching unnaturally wide as she stood in the doorway. The woman from aisle 7. She didn't move, not at first. She simply stood there, her eyes black voids leaking tar-like substance down her face. Her long, bony fingers twitched, her joints bending at impossible angles as she tilted her head to the side, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if my body was frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer horror of what I was seeing. The rules flashed in my head again, and a gut-wrenching terror seized me. Don't engage. Do not call the authorities. Go to the break room immediately. But I was already in the break room. The woman was inside the store. She had entered. I should have left. I should have broken the rules. But the idea of being fired, of violating those rules, it felt like my only tether to reality. Stay calm. Stay calm. She tilted her head further, her spine cracking as it contorted in unnatural ways. With a slow, deliberate motion, she raised one long finger to her lips. Shh. The word echoed in my mind. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, couldn't move my body. Every part of me screamed to run, to break the glass and escape. But I couldn't. It was like my body was trapped in this moment, suspended in time. Then, as if her mere presence was enough to bend the laws of reality, the lights in the break room flickered again. The sound of the jazz music that had been playing earlier suddenly stopped, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence. I knew the rule. If the music stopped, I had to retreat to the break room. But I was already here. What did it mean now? Was I trapped? The woman took a single step toward me. Her feet shuffled slowly across the floor, dragging with a sickening scraping sound. Don't break the rules, don't break the rules. I repeated it like a mantra in my mind, hoping that somehow, if I stayed still enough, the nightmare would end. But it didn't. With a sharp, wet snap, her mouth opened impossibly wide, her grin widening to a grotesque and inhuman degree. Her teeth were jagged and black, stained with a viscous fluid that dripped down her chin. "Aaron!" she rasped, her voice a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have taken this job." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was rooted in place, my body unwilling to obey. Her voice grew louder, more frantic. "You'll never leave. Not now. Not ever." She lunged at me, her body moving in an unnatural, jerking motion. I had a split second to react, just enough time to shove myself away from the desk and into the corner of the room. The woman's face collided with the wall, her body jerking back like a puppet on a string. She blinked, and when her eyes met mine again, the tar-like substance had stopped flowing. And then, nothing. The store was still. The break room was silent. I dared not move. I dared not breathe. For a long moment, there was only the soft hum of the store's overhead lights and the faint buzz of the security cameras. I glanced at the clock. 6 a.m. The shift was over. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door. The store was empty, as it had been when I first arrived. The flickering streetlights outside cast long shadows across the lot. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I sprinted to my car, my heart racing, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. I didn't dare look back. The moment I climbed into my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I sped out of the parking lot, not caring about the speed limit or the rules. I needed to get out of that place. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The store sat behind me, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The lights flickered one last time. And I knew, deep down, that I would never be free of Henry's Market. I had left the store, but it hadn't let me go.